This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share. This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Anand-Sami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Srdoc, economist and chairman of the think tank Adriatic Institute for Public Policy and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. We are delighted to have the Honorable Edwin Meese III join us this weekend on America's Roundtable. The Honorable Edwin Meese III served as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from 1985 to 1988. He was counselor to President Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 1985, functioning as the President's chief policy advisor. He had management responsibility for the administration of the cabinet, policy development, and planning and evaluation, and was a member of the National Security Council. Mr. Meese served as Governor Reagan's executive assistant and chief of staff in California from 1969 through 1974 and as legal affairs secretary from 1967 to 1968. Before joining Governor Reagan's staff in 1967, he was Deputy District Attorney of Alameda County, California. Mr. Meese is a distinguished fellow and holder of the Ronald Reagan Chair in Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and a member of the Board of Regents of the National College of District Attorneys, and a distinguished senior fellow at the Institute of United States Studies, University of London. He's a member of the founding policy board at the Carlson Center for Public Policy. We are honored to have you with us on America's Roundtable, Mr. Meese.
Thank you. It's good to be with you and your listeners.
We were just wondering, what do you think of our current challenges from the high unemployment and the high national debt of $16 trillion, and what would you suggest as ideas to tackling these grave challenges we face in our nation?
Well, I think it's interesting to note that we have a parallel situation that occurred some 30 years ago when Ronald Reagan was faced with a similar economic situation when he took office. And his remedy was basically four things: reducing tax rates across the board. He didn't believe in class warfare or divisiveness. Secondly, regulatory reform. Third, stable monetary policies. And fourth, slowing the growth of federal spending. All of these worked. We had a rapid increase in employment. We had a rapid decrease in inflation, which was the problem then. And we had the start of the longest period of peacetime economic growth in the history of the country. By contrast, today, the current administration has taken the opposite tack in every one of those areas. The president constantly talks about wanting to increase taxes. He has increased regulations exponentially over the past 3.5 years. We have now the beginnings of inflation due to the excessive spending and the very high deficits, as well as, of course, the increase, almost a 50% increase in the national debt since he took office. And instead of slowing the growth of federal spending, we have had gigantic increases in each of the 4 years in which he's been in office. So it's not surprising, really, that we have a continuation of the recession in terms of the economic downturn, as well as the lack of a recovery, which we had, as I say, 30 years ago.
There is quite a bit of uncertainty, Mr. Meese, in the marketplace. And what will it take for that certainty to arrive, whereby entrepreneurs, business leaders will be able to, once again, invest in the economy and create jobs?
Well, I think what it will take will be several things. First of all, a continuation and a permanency to the tax situation we have today, which is the result of the very good work on taxation that was done by President George W. Bush. And if those are continued, that will be one area where people will know what the situation is ahead, rather than what is now looming on the horizon, which is a series of tax increases in so many different ways, not just from the expiration of the Bush tax reductions, but also the potential taxation that's included in Obamacare, which has literally dozens of new taxes, which will hurt business, as well as Obamacare itself with all of the regulations and all the requirements on businesses. So it would be the increase and stabilization of the tax situation, the repeal of Obamacare, the prospect of fewer rather than more regulation over the next 4 years. All of these things would contribute to a sense of certainty, a sense of stability that I think would be the foundation for a real economic recovery.
We're delighted to have as our guest, our special guest, the Honorable Edwin Meese III, who served as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from 1985 to 1988. Mr. Meese, in regard to the recent speech delivered by Mr. Obama in the United Nations, whereby the Wall Street Journal quotes that in his 30-minute speech, Mr. Obama defended his record on the Arab Spring and said the U.S. must stand by emerging democracies. And it's interesting to note that Mr. Obama held no formal meetings with world leaders during his 24-hour visit to New York. You served in President Ronald Reagan's administration, and when looking at what transpired just in these past few days, what are your observations when reviewing President Obama's policies, specifically on the foreign policy front?
Well, I think that we have two things. Both we have policies, most of which have been, unfortunately, not in the United States' interest. He has abandoned our alliance with Israel and the support of the one real democracy that we have in the Middle East and the real ally. His apology tours that have been repeated since the time he was running for office, right up to the present. His reduction in the strength of our armed forces, which continues into the budget that he provided for next year, his essentially appeasement of many of the hostile forces around the world, and his embrace of dictators and people hostile to the United States, such as Hugo Chavez and others. All of these things have hurt our foreign policy in terms of what the actual principles of our foreign policy are. But beyond that has been the performance. He does not attend the daily briefings by the intelligence authorities of the country, as most presidents have in the past. He has not had cabinet meetings or national security meetings on a regular basis. His amount of governing is illustrated by the fact that his trip to New York, other than the speech to the United Nations, his principal activity there was apparently appearing on questionable television shows rather than carrying out what is usually the pattern of presidents in New York for the UN, is to conduct bilateral meetings with other countries.
Honorable Meese, you talked and wrote quite a lot about judicial activism, and we had Constitution Day. Just remembering that 225 years ago, the United States Constitution came to light, and which stands as the world's oldest national constitution still in use and the shortest constitution. Today's judicial activism goes against devotion to the rule of law, intricate to the Constitution. Could you kindly share with us and the listeners more about it?
Yes, indeed. The whole idea of the Constitution, which was a written Constitution, and with that, the creation of an independent judiciary, that is, one that was not supposed to be involved in politics or guided by, temporary political ideas or temporary political moods of the country, but was to support the Constitution and rule on its basis, on the basis of what the Constitution actually said. Judicial activism, of course, is where judges substitute their own personal ideas, their political biases, or their policy preferences for what the law or the Constitution actually reads. And when you have that, you have a subversion of constitutional government. You are taking away then from the elected branches the proper role that they're supposed to play in setting and changing policy, whereas the court's role is simply to make sure that those policies comport with the actual laws that Congress has enacted and ultimately the Constitution, and particularly the provisions relating to preserving the liberty of the people.
Right, and Mr. Meese, how can we prevent judicial activism from happening?
Well, there are two bodies in the in the Constitution that are required to concur on the appointment of judges. One, of course, is the president, who nominates candidates for the judiciary, and secondly, the Senate, which has to approve them. These are the two bodies that need to be held responsible for the kind of judges we get, judges that would be faithful to the Constitution rather than those who would engage in judicial activism.
We read about your pieces on the law of the sea treaty, and we know that President Reagan strongly opposed the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. He actually very publicly refused to sign it, as you said. It is, again, under consideration by the Senate. At that time, actually, Reagan's statement proclaimed that the U.S. had a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone in conformity with the treaty. And I would like your comment as well about a particular situation where we see that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is actually very prone to manipulation. We have circumstances within European Union where European Union precludes particular countries from proclaiming their exclusive economic zone, which means that the countries concede their economic zone, and in that case, UN convention really is not valid. It is very important to stress that there are countries that uphold the rule of law and conventions that they sign, meaning when US signs something, it abides by it. There are countries that don't do the same thing. So in light of that, would you kindly elaborate on where do we stand today with U.S. position?
Yes. First of all, the Law of the Sea Treaty, or LOST as we think of it, is not necessary for any advantage to the United States. We were surrendering a great deal of sovereignty. And thirdly, there is the idea that a treaty would stop any of our opponents or those who had hostile actions against the United States from doing things that would hurt us is ridiculous. A single piece of paper like this would not stop someone who really was opposed to the best interests of the United States. So it has no value, it's unnecessary, and it actually would be disadvantageous to our sovereignty. For all of these reasons, it is a very bad treaty for the United States, and I am happy to say that at this point we have enough senators who are opposed to the treaty to keep it from being ratified.
Mr. Meese, you were a part of the founding policy board at the Carlson Center for Public Policy. Could you share with our listeners very briefly the mission of the Carlson Center for Public Policy and what you hope to achieve with your fellow colleagues?
Yes, the Carlson Center, named after the late Robert Carlson, who was the Director of Social Welfare in California for then Governor Reagan's very successful welfare reform, and who was the architect, really, of the welfare reforms that were started by Ronald Reagan in 1988 and ultimately completed in 1996 by the Republican-passed welfare reform program, where after he had vetoed it twice, they finally persuaded President Clinton to sign. Bob Carlson was a staunch defender of the principles that Ronald Reagan espoused, such as individual liberty, limited government, strong national defense, traditional American values, and free market economics. And basically, it is those principles that the Carlson Center is created to preserve and to expound.
Just a final question for you, Mr. Meese. A few nations within NATO have been backsliding on promises to reform, primarily from the Balkan region, with rampant corruption, the growth of Balkan route trafficking humans, mainly children and young women, illicit drugs and weapons into the heart of Europe. This has been a serious issue altogether. And major media, including the BBC and Europe's independent media groups, have reported that one of NATO's newest members, Croatia, held parliamentary elections last year with over 1 million illegal votes for a nation of 4 million. What should America's leaders and the West do to raise these troubling issues and, from our engagement through NATO, address these major assaults on liberty and the rule of law?
Well, I think it's very important that we uphold the liberty of all people, and particularly the protection against human trafficking and slavery wherever it shows up. The main real sources of human trafficking these days are in labor trafficking, prostitution-type trafficking, sex trafficking, in other words, and pornography, particularly child pornography. And I think it's very important that we stand up. There's a conference coming up in the United States very soon here on this whole subject, and I think our government, as well as other organizations, business people, and others, should be very much aware of this scourge and do everything we can to prevent it, and to use all fora, whether it be NATO, United Nations, or conferences such as the one being held here, in order to proclaim the serious jeopardy that this puts the most vulnerable people among us in, and how we must take every step possible to prevent it.
Thank you very much, Attorney General Meese. We appreciate your time and certainly wish you the very best in your important schedule and the work that you're accomplishing.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been good to be with you.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.